You are doing awesome work. To recap, let's talk a little bit about what you've done. So the first thing that you did is you defined a rule structure that mirrors our actual database. Then, using that rule structure, you created validations for both properties and entire objects. Next, we figured out what kind of read and write rules that you need for each root node, and that's all been laid out for you in a spec. So now we're ready to actually implement those rules, of course using those handy UID mapping and owner mapping rules that you just made. But before I throw you in the wild of writing read and write rules, I wanted to give you a couple tips and tricks about troubleshooting, because you might be wondering, how do you actually test a rule when it's not working? So my first tip is a oldie but a goodie, and it's basically to turn on the debug mode. This gives you access to all sorts of good data. In the case of a read, it will show you the exact location you're trying to read from. And in the case of a write, it'll show you the exact data that you're sending to the app that might or might not be getting denied. In addition, though, Firebase actually provides you with a simulator to test out reading and writing data. And the simulator is pretty cool because it allows you to very clearly see what's happening with your permissions. Okay, so in the Firebase dashboard, you can go ahead and go over to the simulator tab. And for our app, because login is so important, you're going to want to select a custom auth. The provider doesn't matter, but the UID does. This will make it so that when you're using your read-write rules, in this case the provider isn't important, but you should put in a UID of a pre-existing user in your app. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and put in Kagure's UID. And I just copied and pasted this over from my data here, where if you look at the UID mappings, you can grab her UID. Okay, so I put in Kagure's UID and I can press authenticate, and this will basically make it so I am impersonating Kagure. And then here I can simulate different read or write rules. Write rules allow you to also specify some data that you're trying to write. So for example, if you wanted to test that rule that you just created, you could find a shopping list that Kagure is shared on, another list that she's the owner of, and finally a list that she has nothing to do with, and make sure that they all give the correct responses. So for example, I'm going to get a shopping list that Kagure is shared on. So over here, I'm looking at Kagure's lists. Okay, here's one that she's shared on, and it has the name K7J0. So I'll go over here to shopping list items, go to list K7J0, and then I'll go ahead and open that link in another tab. I'm going to copy this location, and then over here in the simulator, I can put that location that I just copied here. So basically, I'm now doing a simulated read for shopping list items for that list that she was shared on. Okay, and I'm already authenticated as her. So I can come down here, and I'm authenticated as Kagure. I'm trying to read at this list that she shared on, and I can press simulate read. And it says here that the read is allowed, and it even goes through each of the rules at these different steps. So you get a lot of output information, and it'll tell you actually if there are multiple rules along the path, which one it passes and which one it fails. So it's very useful. And so similarly, I could take a list that she's not a part of, which she's not a part of this list, and I could simulate a read, and it would show that the read was denied and point out which of these rules was false. Finally, Bolt can be a pretty helpful tool for writing rules, including read and write rules. As I mentioned, checking whether a user is shared on a list or the owner of a list is a fairly common rule. You've also probably seen that it's a little bit long to write. Bolt allows you to write functions and then use those functions in different places. And this essentially gives you a pretty easy way to make fairly similar rules in a bunch of different parts of the rule stock. So here's a quick example of a function in Bolt. And I'm not going to go over the semantics of all of it. I'll provide a link to some of the Bolt documentation for that. But basically, it's doing the lookup in that UID mappings table to get you the encoded email. And here's another function, which when passed in a list ID parameter, it goes into the owner mappings node and gets you back the owner email for that list. And here's yet another function, which combines these two other functions to get your encoded email and compare it to the email of a list. So you might write up a bunch of functions in Bolt, and then in your paths part of your Bolt file, you can write something like this. And what this rule is basically doing is saying for a list name in a specific shopping list, the owner of that shopping list is the only one who can change the list name. And while you had to write all these functions, you can now use this isOwner function in as many places as you want. So there might be 10 places in the app that you want to check for ownership. All you have to do now is write this isOwner function call. A full explanation of writing functions in Bolt is accessible in the instructor notes, but hopefully this is enough to prove to you that using Bolt might be a good idea. So now that you know the different options for troubleshooting and debugging your rules, do you think that you could write the rest of the read, write, and validate rules that I'm giving you in the spec right now?